So let's get our terminology together here. As I refer to the different parts, I want to make sure that you understand my terminology, and undoubtedly you've heard the same terminology, but let's get on the same page with it. Here's the highlight, here's the halftone light. This would be called the core shadow, that dark area between where the direct light is and where the bounce light just can't quite get into. And then down here we have the bounce or the reflected light. This surface is bouncing light back up into our sphere here. So reflected light. We also have atmospheric light. If this were the sunlight, then the blue of the sky coming down from above would give a little bit of illumination to the top planes here. That's why we have a dark here, but then it gets lighter out here. That cool atmospheric light from above is illuminating that top plane. But this occlusion in here, and that's our term, a photographic term for a deep recess that doesn't get much or any light into it, we have our dark occlusion in here. So let me give you a little bit of a trick. I shouldn't even call it a trick, let's call it a principle. Because remember, we said that your medium cannot capture all of the nuances that your eye can see. So let's look at an artist who knows what she's doing, the artist Susan Lyon, who's making an artistic decision instead of mindlessly rendering. Here we have a subject, beautifully rendered. In this case it's oil paint, but with a good dark stick of charcoal and a bright white piece of paper, you could do the same image. You could do the same image in charcoal. So clearly what's important in this image is what's in shadow. You see all of this bright rim light? She has intentionally taken that, even though her eye surely could see detail within it, she's taken that bright direct light and made it very, very light and washed out in value, leaving her a tremendous value range to get all of this nuance and shadow. So she has made the artistic decision that this is more about what's happening in the shadow and less about what's happening in the light. If we diagram that, she's saying, okay, even though I can see a lot of detail in the light, that's not what my painting's about. So I'm going to push everything in the light into a very narrow value range, edit out information, so that I have all of this value range relegated to the shadow, so I can show a lot of turning form and give a lot of information in the shadow. That's her way of dealing with the challenge of not being able to render everything that she sees, so making a choice to deal with that. Here's a different decision by the same artist. Now, instead of being primarily interested in what's in the shadow, she's primarily interested in what's in the light. So surely her eye could see a whole lot of detail, hair, ear, earring in that shadow, but she's chosen to push it into a very narrow dark value range so that she has a very wide value range in the light to turn those forms. In essence, making the opposite decision, pushing everything that's into shadow in that narrow value range so that she has all of this value range to turn form and to give detail in the light. Once again, her solution to the problem that she can't render everything, so she's making an artistic choice. And so I encourage you to take a look at her work. Susan Lyon is a gifted portrait artist. I think you'll enjoy her work, and I want to give her credit where credit is due. So we'll move on to talk a little bit more about this Riley abstraction that we've been discussing the last couple of weeks. But before we do, let me just make a comment here about what we've just been looking at, about this idea of making value choices. I'll just scroll back here, making choices about where you want to emphasize your subject and where you want to maybe group or simplify a little bit more. I don't want anyone to come out of this discussion feeling like, well, Nathan said that you always have to either choose the light to render or choose the shadow to render. This isn't a formula. It's not a must-do. That's just one idea of dealing with this challenge of the limitations of working from life. So the core idea here is not that you have to do it this way or that way or the other way, though those are excellent ways. The point is you have to make a choice what you'll edit and what you'll emphasize, because once again, you can't do everything that you can see. So these are a couple of ideas that let you deal with that. Okay, so let's jump back here. So we've looked at this idea of using this kind of abstraction to help us parse and understand the complexities of the head. So let me comment one more time about this, because at this stage, now that we're officially talking about light and shadow, all I'm doing as I work value into this structure is I'm saying to myself, what is in light and what is in shadow? And how does that shadow wrap around the three-dimensional forms in my head? And that's why this abstraction is so helpful. You can see that I'm really using it to my advantage to find where that light and shadow meet. Okay, just those two things. Next now, I'm really pushing, trying to get a sense of halftone, highlights, curving away into halftone, the halftone curving into core shadow, and some of this bounce light coming into the sides. Okay? I'm thinking about edges between the light and shadow. That being where there's a soft turning form, of course you get a soft edge from light into shadow. Even on the nose, it's quite abrupt, but still a softer transition from light to shadow. Right here, a softer transition from light to shadow. But where you have a cast shadow, because this is a point light source, a spotlight or sunlight, where you have a cast shadow, that's where you get your sharp edges. Cast shadow from the nose, quite a sharp edge. Cast shadow from the jaw, quite a sharp edge. Even this right here, that's a cast shadow. The light curves around and then casts a shadow here, so you get quite a sharp edge there, sharp edge here, sharp edge there. Those are in fact fairly sharp cast shadows. Even right there, this is a softer transition, but that eyelid casts a shadow onto the cheek here, and so that's where those hard and soft edges appear. That's what you can look for in your head. All the time, you're keeping the eye on the absolute simplest statement possible. This whole thing is just a big egg shape. It's like a big sphere. And so we treat that whole forehead like it's a sphere. That nose is just like a mini sphere. Highlight, halftone, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, just like it's a tiny sphere. Same with the chin. The chin is just like a tiny sphere, a small sphere protruding from the head. Highlight, halftone, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, same principle. Even this muzzle of the mouth, this big shape that protrudes from the head with the lips, we can simplify it into the idea that it has highlight, halftone, core shadow, a little bit of reflected light. The eyeball, same thing. Eyes are so hard until you learn to think of them as a sphere protruding from the eye. Highlight, halftone, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, and then of course there are the local changes, the iris and the planes and so forth in the eye. But that simple statement of treating the eye as a sphere is so liberating from the mind-numbing difficulties that eyes can have. So absolute simple statement is what we're always falling back on. And so let's take that idea a little further. Let's push that back into a sphere shape, and now as a proof of concept, let's take that sphere and do that eyeball idea that I was talking about. So we cannot let ourselves get caught up in that symbolic thinking. That might be a very interesting kind of an art form. It's very Egyptian, very hieroglyphic, but we're doing representationalism here today. We're doing light and shadow. So we're keeping away from that kind of symbolic rendering that our mind wants to push us towards something that has real form and real structure. The eye has form, those eyelids have geometrical structure, and so I am emphasizing that. Big simple statement of the geometry of what's in light and what's in shadow. Now we know, of course, there are local changes. Within that, we have the white of the eye, the iris of the eye. There's a wetter more reflective surface inside the eye and a more matte surface for the skin, so we can put those local changes within our simple statement of the eye and then push it to some of the naturalistic folds of skin. And we have an eye based on our simple geometric light and shadow thinking, and we can push that into an eye that is in fact an eye in one of my portrait sketches. So let's zoom out from that. So in this portrait study, it's true that there's a lot potentially going on. There's all the ins and outs of the form, the hair, the earring, but as artists, we've always got to look for that simple statement first. And so let me make that point here. So I'm doing that noise reduction filter that edits out the detail but leaves us with the value statement and the edges. This is the equivalent again of squinting. That idea of looking at your subject, squinting your eyes way down so all that detail is edited out and all you can see are the simple masses and relationships. This is the digital equivalent of that. So here's how our thinking has to be. It just, it ultimately, when we're roughing in the light and shadow, it just cannot be, well, here's a thing on the forehead here, and there's the eye this and that, and the eyebrow thing here, and the other thing there. And we have this tendency to see all of these individual parts as different things. Cannot do it, my friends. As artists, we have to learn how to mask our values. Here's her hair. This side of it is in light. This side of it is in shadow. Here's the big egg shape of her head. It's not cheek here and a forehead there. No, it's this big massive side plane in light. Turning, all of this falls into shadow. So it's not an eye, a cheek, it's all of this stuff turns into shadow. And then all of this turns into a side plane. Catching the light, and then it turns away from the light back into shadow, and then the side planes on this other side catching some of that reflected light, giving us the sense of a side plane here. That's how you must learn to see and render as an artist. Then you can come back in and you can do all of the detail work that you want, all of the detail work that your time allows for, as long as that detail work does not disturb the simple value statement. For most beginners, intermediate, even sometimes for us professional artists, that detail work risks going too far and hurting that simple statement. Watch out.